Good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining and welcome, Nick Aldworth. My name is Ian Pennell. I'm the Senior Director and Sector Leader here at CriticalArc, the provider of SafeZone. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Nick Aldworth, who many of you will be familiar with Nick's work over the last few years, instrumental in leading the Martyn's Law legislation. Nick, good afternoon. I'm delighted that you're able to join us this afternoon. For those that haven't met you previously, perhaps you could just give us a quick introduction and background to your career to date and how you've become involved with the Martyn's Law legislation.
Thanks, Ian. It's really great to talk to you. As you know, and as people who know me will know, that it's never going to be a quick answer, mate. But 41 years of protective security across the military, the police, and the private sector. Probably most relevant was a very intense period of 5 or 6 years between 2016 and 2019. That's 3 years, isn't it? But a period around there where I led counter-terrorism units in London and then subsequently nationally. And of course, that fell across the period of those awful attacks in 2017, 4 in London and 1 in Manchester, and then subsequently attacks in 2018 and 2019. And I learned a lot from those things. I saw a lot of failure. I saw a lot of success. And it led me to the doorway of a woman called Fegan Murray, whose son had been murdered in the Manchester Arena bombing. And Fegan was trying to garner support for a government online petition looking for better security at venues where we all gather for work, rest and play. And she wasn't getting much traction, unfortunately. And so I started working with her, and an amazing political participant called Brendan Cox, whose wife was the MP Jo Cox, who had been murdered some years before by an extreme right-wing advocate. And we came up with this cunning idea for a thing called Martyn's Law. And the rest is almost history, not quite. Campaigning for 5.5 years. We were having a conversation this morning, and we're on our 5th Prime Minister, our 5th Home Secretary, and our 7th Security Minister. So on that basis, we should have probably formed the last government. But the bill is now in Parliament. And I'm sure as we go through this conversation, we'll tease a few more things out of that. But protective security and counter-terrorism has been my man's life's work.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. And it'd be really interesting in a moment just to get into, what the anticipated next steps look like, and indeed the timescale for those as the bill passes through Parliament into legislation. But for those that are listening to this that maybe have heard about Martyn's Law, but maybe aren't terribly familiar with the detail, can you provide us with a very concise summary, and that will probably provide a segue into a bit more detail around the various aspects and more detailed components of the legislation?
Yeah, of course. And of course, when we meet in a week or so's time at your conference, I'm going to go into a lot more detail. But ostensibly, Martyn's Law is about making people who are responsible for publicly accessible locations now statutorily responsible for keeping those locations safe from terrorism. That's it in a nutshell. There's lots of nuances about how that's done and what methodologies are undertaken to make that happen, and the impact across multiple different sectors. But in essence, it's about making sure our premises are safe from terrorism. It's not about stopping terrorism. It won't do that. But what it will do is it will reduce the impact of terrorism, i.e. it will manage the consequences of those awful occurrences that will still sadly continue in our society.
So how will that differ from the existing duty of care obligations that organisations have, whether that's employers' liability, health and safety legislation, corporate liability, etc.? What will be the sort of fundamental difference that takes us from that current position to what is being proposed under Martyn's Law?
Yeah, well, the key difference is that liability laws, so as you say, public liability, employer liability, they are only found on default. So you actually have to do something wrong, and usually it's something awful has to happen before that liability becomes live, as it were. What Martyn's law does, it creates a statutory obligation for you to be doing it right in the first place. So actually, we don't have to wait for a terrorist attack for you to break that law. You can break it by not registering with the regulator, by not complying with the statutory requirements for having a plan. There'll be lots of ways that that can be breached. And in that respect, it's just like any other primary statute in the UK. It definitely has some synergy with health and safety, certainly in terms of being driven by the need to educate people and getting people to do the right thing voluntarily before you start looking at using compliance tools like fines and criminal sanctions. But in essence, that's the core difference, is you can be in breach of the new law by just not following the rules. Liabilities are very different. You actually have to be found out.
Okay, and in terms of the shape of the legislation, who will this apply to, and how will it differ for different types of organisations?
So the bill will apply to both premises and events, and there's a pretty comprehensive list inside the bill of the types of premises that will be engaged by the law. But they do cover the widest range of places where we work, where we rest, where we play. And it will range from typically obvious, retail and hospitality, where we've actually seen terrorist attacks in the UK. It will include higher education and healthcare, where in particular healthcare, we've now seen 2 attempted terrorist attacks against hospitals in the UK in recent years. Higher education, we've seen plenty of attacks against higher education around the world. Places of worship, transport that's not regulated by other statutory instruments, such as airports, for example, will be excluded. Hotels, exhibitions, conferences, all those things where we gather as groups of people. And it's that's really the defining point, Ian, is that we've known for some time now that terrorists have shifted away from attacking infrastructure. They've shifted to some degree away from attacking, direct government representation, such as police officers and military, albeit both those sectors are still at very significant threat. It's a lot easier now for terrorists to attack people, to attack the public, and the best place to do that is obviously where they're gathering en masse, and that's really what's predicated the list of in-scope premises. As far as events go, it has the same ethos. It's about protecting places where we gather, to make it easier to manage and easier to regulate. There are some definitions around that, and in particular, the main definition is the entry point at which it becomes a in-scope event, and that's where you might reasonably expect there to be 800 people at the same time from time to time at that event. And I think that's important, because what that really does is it knocks out, those sorts of family gatherings, weddings, that sort of thing, which, while I'm not saying there's no threat to those sorts of events, I'm definitely not saying that. Law has to have a practical aspect to it. And certainly when we were looking at how this might evolve and grow, the government was very clear that it wanted to be proportionate about the impact of this.
And clearly, the definitions that you've just described of the venues that are in scope certainly helps organisations to identify if it applies to them. In terms of, once I've identified it applies to me as the owner or operator of a public accessible location, how do I then define what I need to do? The definitions of, those reasonably practical security measures that I'm being asked to comply with.
Yes, that's a really pertinent question that's at the heart of the legislation. So just to contextualise it, and I mentioned this just now, is that the government always wanted this to be proportionate legislation. And one of the points that was raised in the Manchester Inner Inquiry, which was, a watermark in how we view protective security in the UK. But one of the points made there was that there is a different need to apply security at a large tens of thousands venue versus Mrs. Miggins' pie shop that might, house small hundreds of people. And so the government came up with this idea of tiers. And many of the people listening to this might well have been familiar with that original concept of there being effectively two standards. The new bill that's in Parliament has refined that slightly further, but the same concept effectively applies, that you now have a standard duty of premises, and that's premises that range from 200 to 799 people reasonably expected to be on the premises at the same time from time to time. And maybe we'll talk about those definitions a bit more when we meet in a week or so's time, because they do complicate it. And that would have been what some of the viewers of this interview might recognise as the old standard tier, albeit the old standard tier, the entry point was 100, not 200. And then there is understandably an enhanced duty on us all to look after those places that are a bit bigger. So we'd call those the old enhanced tier, and that is for premises that have a reasonable expectation of more than 800 or more people on the premises at the same time from time to time. So we have an immediate division. And the responsibilities on the operators of those premises differ according to where they sit. So for the standard duty of premises, we're talking very much about procedures, not measures, not infrastructure, not expense. We're talking about the ability to do some very simple things, but it's encapsulating this idea of have a plan. Plans save lives. No doubt about that. I've seen it, I've experienced it, I'm an advocate of it, and they don't even need to be complex plans. And the government's recognised that. So effectively, for those premises in the standard duty of the bill, they are required to have a public protection procedures plan. And in that plan, there are 4 things that are mandated as a minimum. There could be other things depending on the nature of the premises, but as a minimum, every premises should be able to lock down. Every premises should be able to evacuate. Every premises should be able to evacuate, and every premises should be able to communicate. And overlaid on top of that is the person responsible for those premises should have an understanding of how terrorism might affect that premises and what those plans need to therefore reflect. Now, when we look at what that demand is for your customers, the people who are engaging with CriticalArc and are engaging with Safe Zone, it is fundamental to all of...
Please try again.
You have to excuse me, my Siri just kicked in, as they do from time to time randomly. So it's absolutely critical that people who are implementing a plan can communicate. And the one piece of nearly every plan I've ever seen, whether it's a sophisticated counter-terrorism operation, whether it's on the back of a fag packet, quickly we've got to sort something out. When it goes wrong, it's almost always because people haven't communicated properly or they couldn't communicate. So that's a really important one. And again, when we speak in a week or so's time at the Safe Zone event, I'm going to labour that point quite a lot. This need to be able to communicate effectively, the need to both transmit information, but also to receive information. So I'm conscious I've talked for a few minutes there, Ian, and we've talked about just for standard duty. I'm going to talk about the enhanced duty now. So that's these bigger premises. And what I want to do is just to anchor that to start with in the fact that an enhanced duty premises, might sound obvious, must always comply with the standard duty procedures as well. So an enhanced duty premises, doesn't matter how big you are, you've got to be able to lock down, evacuate, and communicate. But on top of that, the enhanced duty premises are expected to take measures, not just procedures, to have measures. And again, the government have helpfully created a minimum application for that need. And the minimum things that the government state are that an enhanced duty premises must be able to monitor the premises or event and their immediate vicinity, control the movement of individuals into, out of, or within the premises or event, provide physical safety and security of the premises. Now, that's the big ticket item, I think, on enhanced duty, because that implies infrastructure. It's doors, it's gates, it's windows. And then the last one is quite an interesting one. It's secure information which may assist in the planning, preparation, and execution of acts of terrorism. I'm going to cover that one first, if I may, because I can put it to bed fairly quickly. One of the features of society is that we are the information generation. We are the information age. And when we look back on in millennia's time, this will be the time everybody says, oh yeah, those are the guys who are really obsessed with data and information. And the result of that is we publish so much information on publicly accessible forums such as the internet. The problem with that is that we also know that's where terrorists start their planning. And we know that on almost all terrorist attacks, that has started by surfing the internet, A, to find targets, and then B, to explore what the opportunities are for an attack against that target. So that criteria is very much about, we've got to protect that information. We've got to not make it quite so readily available. There's going to be some big challenges around that because information is often associated with customer service, but I think we can work it out. What I then quickly cover now is monitoring, control, and physical safety and security. So monitoring, the guidance associated with the bill gives some ideas around that. And of course, the obvious thing about monitoring premises is CCTV, isn't it? And for many of your customers and people listening to this, CCTV will probably be their default position around monitoring their premises. But it's not, doesn't need to be exclusively that. It can be people, it can be technical. I think the important learning that we took from the Manchester Arena inquiry, though, was if it is technical and people, it needs to work and it needs to cover where the threats come from. Otherwise, it's probably pointless even having it. And the control of movement, that implies either technical or physical measures to stop people from coming in and out of premises unmonitored. That is really important because if somebody can come in and out the premises, not only can they conduct a physical attack themselves, but they can leave things. And that's not great security. And then I touched just now around what the physical safety and security elements of this will mean. It is the bit that references, you know, we can't allow people just to come in and out of these premises. We need to have doors that lock. We need to have windows that are going to be blast resistant. We need to have security functions that allow people to only go to where they're allowed to be. So that was quite a long answer. I apologize for the length of that, but that is pretty much the bill encapsulated, you know, in that brief sort of 5-10 minutes.
So for organisations that will fall in scope, and I'm thinking more about, you know, what we've referred to as the larger scale premises, the enhanced tier premises. I might have a security team, for example, and an emergency management team. Surely they're responsible for and accountable for ensuring the things that you've just described are in place, or is there another level of accountability that exists within the proposed legislation?
So I think it reverts back to, you know, the opening ambitions of the legislation, which is, you know, are those steps sufficient to reduce the threat to the public from terrorist attack through effective preparation and response? And that will vary from premises to premises. It will vary according to the potential threats that those premises face. But let's use a good example that I know that many of your customers will be very familiar with. Perhaps it's a university campus or a hospital. And nearly all of those places that I've worked with have a security team, and they are great. They perform lots of different functions, quite often associated with safeguarding, not just security. And there, I think, is you know, perhaps one of the challenges, which is if 50% of your time is on safeguarding, well, 50% of it isn't on security. And so those sorts of considerations need to come in. But of course, when you're looking at those sorts of places, the estates are enormous, and you very rarely have the ability for a security presence in every part of that estate. And if you're going to accept that, if your response to Martyn's law is that I'm going to resolve any weaknesses I have by a security presence, that probably means you're going to have a person in every building. Not many places will do that. So does that then mean that actually your human resources becomes your response team, so they can get there, get somewhere quickly and resolve it? Great, that's great security. But what's going to stop that incident happening in the first place? Well, you'll know this as well as I do. In a lot of the places I go to, doors don't lock. There's no access control. Anybody can go into those premises. And I think that's the sort of mentality that's got to stop, because not only is that very poor security against general criminality, it's definitely very poor security against terrorism, because it gives free access for the bad guy to the soft targets that are within that building. And there's lots of other issues around that, in particular around safeguarding as well. And I think about universities, lots of young people in these buildings. You get lots of lone working in these buildings when people are staying late to do essays or whatever it is. And they are, for all intents and purposes, quite often unprotected.
Yeah, and I can imagine, certainly within the healthcare sector and the NHS specifically, within the higher education and indeed wider education sectors, both notoriously struggling with financial constraints and various pressures that have been widely publicised in the sector. I can imagine executives nationwide are drawing breath at the prospect of new additional legislation to comply with, and the thought of how on earth are we going to cover the cost of some of these things. And of course, many organizations, as you've described, already have great human security. They have technology infrastructure in the form of CCTV and access control, etc. But are we suggesting that there is a sort of additional investment in capabilities, people, process, and technology that organizations will have to undertake in order to comply with Martyn's law, do you think?
Look, I think for some places, absolutely, definitely. And a good live example of that is I went somewhere recently, and I won't say what sector or where, but I went somewhere recently within the scope of this conversation, multiple buildings, but no way to communicate across those buildings. And so if you were to look at the basic requirement of evacuation, lockdown, how do you signify that you need those things to happen? And even when you take it to a more basic stance than that, which is the government's guidance in the event of a marauding terrorist attack, is to run, hide, or tell. How do you know to implement that unless somebody tells you or guides you, steers you towards shelter? And that's why products like Safe Zone, I think, are actually an incredibly cost-effective approach to resolving some of these problems. I go back to what I said just now, Ian. Communication is key, absolutely key. And so many of our institutions are now quite archaic in terms of infrastructure. You might be lucky, you might have had an old tannoy system in some buildings, but I bet it hasn't been updated. Many probably won't even work. Well, actually, how do you communicate? How do you share information about what's going on a large campus or a large hospital? And products like those that you guys create, I think, fill a really critical gap in helping people prepare to be compliant. They are not the sole solution, but they are a significant facilitator of being able to activate those plans.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess, to that point then, for organizations that are listening this afternoon to our conversation, and they're thinking and trying to be proactive, where do I start as an organization? How do I even begin to prepare and ready myself ahead of the legislation coming into law?
So I will offer a note of caution. So one of the things that has sadly been happening over the last couple of years is people are stepping forward and trying to sell Martyn's Law compliant products. So there is no such thing as a Martyn's Law compliant product. If anybody says to you they can make you compliant with Martyn's Law, chase them for their life. That's twofold. One is because there is no law at the moment. There is a bill in Parliament. Now that can change. I expect it will change to some degree. And I think I'd encourage people to not take action on anything until we see what that bill looks like. And you're in safe hands to do that, because the government is likely to put a 2-year implementation period after the bill receives royal assent. Now, that statement is a dangerous statement for me to make, because some will sit there and think, oh, well, that's Nick Aldworth is saying that it's okay for us not to do anything. I'm going to follow that up by saying, don't do anything to make yourself compliant with Martyn's Law, but get on and make yourself safe and secure. Because if you make yourself safe and secure today against the myriad of threats that we face today, you will be compliant with Martyn's Law. So if there was a starting point on that for me, it would never be product specific, it would be product agnostic. But there are some principles that everybody needs to really understand and embrace. And the first one of those always is understand threat. So I actually get paid sometimes to go and do risk assessment for people, or I get asked to do risk assessment for people, and I refuse to do them unless you've done a threat assessment. Because what are you assessing your risk against unless you've got that baseline of what's going to trouble you? And so start with a threat assessment. And for the people listening to this this conversation today, Ian, I think it's probably worth taking a couple of minutes just to talk about threat. If you go back to earlier this year, there's a guy called Assistant Commissioner Matt Jukes. He's the most senior counterterrorism officer in the UK. He runs the counterterrorism network inside the UK. He basically said, I have never seen the world in a worse state than it is today. And that was back in January. And it hasn't got any better. It's got substantially worse. And over the last 9 or 10 months, we have seen multiple thwarted terrorist attacks. We've seen multiple arrests for different types of offending, quite often, you know, people inciting terrorist acts, sharing information, facilitating terrorism, both overseas, but also importantly in the UK. We've seen convictions only a couple of weeks ago for a person who was planning to attack LGBT communities in Scotland. We are in an incredibly febrile state in the world at the moment. And what that does is it feeds those in the UK who have extremist beliefs. In their mind, it legitimizes the use of violence against society. And so what people need to really take on board from this conversation is that we have a duty now to protect ourselves, our staff, our visitors, our customers from terrorism. And we know how to do it now. You know, we have some of the best advice in the world available in the UK. There's very few other countries that have something as good as the National Protective Security Authority, which is an arm of MI5. There's very few countries in the world that have a significant swathe of their counterterrorism policing committed to providing good quality information to the public. So we have the information and the knowledge we need. What we need to have in our organisations is the wherewithal and the motivation to get on and do it. So the threat level today, as we're recording this on I think it's the 4th of October, is substantial. That means an attack is likely. Now, I don't know why people have a problem believing that information. It is likely, folks. The good people at MI5, MI6, Defence Intelligence and GCHQ, they are listening and monitoring everything that's going on around the world and in the UK, and they have come to the conclusion that an attack is likely. You need to take that at face value. And what we can't do anymore, we can't say, okay, well, it's likely, but it's not likely to be me because I'm a little place in the middle of nowhere. I'm afraid that when you look at the way terrorist attacks have taken place over the last few years, it literally is an attack using anything by anyone against any target anywhere. So we need to take that seriously.
It's a great point that you make about the threat level. And I think many organizations will say, you know, we're in a beautiful part of the country. We're on a campus environment, you know, potentially outside of a city. We have low crime here. I can't possibly see how Martyn's Law applies to us. What would you say to those individuals who, and there are many of them, who share that belief?
So I would say, look at a terrorist attack in Forbury Gardens in Reading. 3 gay men murdered in a park having a picnic. Although not a terrorist incident necessarily, look at Derek Bird's murderous firearms rampage in rural Cumbria. Look at the firearms shootings in Plymouth a few years ago. There is no safe space anymore, Ian, because what happened in 2014 is the Islamic State organization franchised terrorism. And whereas up to that point, a lot of terrorism had been directed by, for want of a better expression, a centralized terrorist brain. You know, they were operatives who were attacking on the instruction of their masters. What the now infamous speech from Islamic State in 2014 said was, look, go off and do it on your own, folks. You know, let's mobilize all those with extremist beliefs. Let's go out there. You figure it out. Use whatever you want. You figure out who you want to attack. Just do it in the name of our beliefs, and run your own franchise as a terrorist. And we're never going to step back from that. We're never going to step back from that. In fact, in many respects, it's got worse, because now what we start to see is mixed and unclear ideologies, where people, particularly young people, seem to be being motivated to commit acts of violence, initially through looking at violence from a particular ideology, but then not really being clear about why they then go and do what they do. And that is becoming quite problematic. When you look at referrals into the UK's Prevent system, and Prevent exists to try and divert people away from extremism, nearly half those referrals are now unclear ideologies. So people are being motivated towards violence for no apparent clear reason. They just see it as an ability to assert their views on the world. So that is not going to go away. Those of you who are looking at this today, if you're 20 years old, you are the inheritor of this for the rest of your professional career. I'm lucky I'm out in about 5 or 10 years' time. But it is here, and we have got to learn to live with it. Part of living with it is what Martyn's Law is going to achieve, which is the mobilizing of society in response to that threat.
And I guess it's a segue from some of the comments that you made that led to your career and the awful events in 2017, 18, 19, etc. Has the nature of the threat changed then? Has it arguably become more complex and less singular, perhaps, than we thought it was, when we think about things like the Manchester Arena attack?
So I think it's become more complex in terms of our ability to understand the why and the wherefore, but it's become far less complex in the delivery. And that's the defining feature of our generation's fight against terrorism, is we are dealing with low sophistication, moderate impact terrorist offences. So sophistication would be a plot to hijack 5 aircraft and fly them into buildings across America. Sophistication would be the ability to perhaps build multiple bombs and have them go off at the same time on the London Tube network. That's pretty sophisticated thinking, sophisticated planning. Doesn't happen overnight. Low sophistication is walking into a high street store, buying a sharp knife and walking straight back out and stabbing somebody. And that's the challenge now. The challenge is identifying those people who wish to do that simple act, who may not kill hundreds, may not even kill tens, but will have a dramatic impact on our psyche as a society and the manner in which we wish to have the UK seen overseas, which is a safe liberal democracy.
Yeah. So just sort of shifting gears slightly now, I suppose, in terms of, having an understanding of the legislation and some of the aspects that organisations will need to comply with. What do the next steps look like, and indeed the timescale of those next steps and the call to action for organisations? You've mentioned that sort of period to bed in the legislation that is geared much more around education rather than enforcement. Can you maybe just describe what we anticipate as the next steps and the timetable that they'll be implemented?
Yeah, sure. So the parliamentary process is relatively straightforward, but can be convoluted depending on how contentious a piece of legislation is or isn't, or how contentious it's perceived to be. So the next hearing for the Martyn's Law Bill is on the 14th of October. So I think it's the day before we're meeting at conference. And what that will be is the first opportunity for the merits of the bill to be debated in the House of Commons. And that hearing can go on for half an hour or several hours. But it's the first opportunity for supporters and opponents of the legislation to express their views inside Parliament. Once that has happened, and those debates don't result in a vote or anything like that, they're literally just an exploration of the issues. The government come away from that debate, though, with a sense of whether or not the bill is going to have much opposition. Now, we don't expect the bill to have much opposition because it had cross-party support. It was a bill that the Conservatives had agreed to bring in. It is a bill that Labour are bringing in, and the Liberal Democrats have signalled their support for us. So we expect there to be broad support. After that, a committee is convened, chaired by the Security Minister, and once a week over several weeks, they meet and they go through the bill line by line. They make sure that it achieves what it sets out to achieve. They identify weaknesses, they identify strengths. And occasionally, but not often, the government might at that point make some amendments to the bill. That then comes back as a report. And if we look at the timeline on this now, so October the 14th is fixed in time. That's the second hearing.
Yep.
The Public Bill Committee probably constituted end of October, early November. So we're likely now to be running into the new year with the report stage. And the report is basically the findings of the Bill Committee. And Parliament gets to consider whether or not that report validates or criticises the legislation. And at that point, we might see amendments being put forward. So if parties aren't happy with the legislation or disagree with what the report says, they might table an amendment. An amendment is exactly as that word suggests. It's somebody who wishes to see a piece of legislation change. It's not a wholesale rejection of the legislation. It's just a nuance, usually, around what they want to achieve. And then once that stage is over, it goes to a third hearing. And I think we're looking now at late first quarter, probably, for that to happen. And that's a vote. That's the House of Commons saying, yep, this is what we want, let's do it. Then it goes to the Lords, and that process I've just described is repeated in the Lords. So how long is a piece of string on that one? Hard to say. There are some political imperatives on this, which I would like to think have something to play in this, which is the 22nd of May next year will be the 8th anniversary of the Manchester Arena bombing. It will be about 3 years after the Manchester Arena inquiry reported part 1, which highlighted the deficiencies and the need for change. And I think going beyond that date, politically not great. So I'm optimistic that we might see the bill given royal assent, which is the bit which the Lords say yes and the King signs it off. I mean, how amazing is that? We see a piece of legislation, and then that's the point at which the enactment clock starts, and that will be that probably 2-year period. And the 2-year period is really to allow the regulator chance to build itself. And it's also, more importantly, it's a period that allows all those who are in scope of the bill to start complying with it.
Yeah, I guess there'll be lots of organisations that, to your point earlier, the legislation, the detail of the legislation that needs to be complied with isn't yet available. But I also have in my ears your comments about, good security practice and beginning to close the gap on, those aspects of a security posture within an organisation that will fall in scope in order to minimise effectively the amount of work that will need to be done once the legislation is passed, etc. I suppose there's a question that I'd ask now, for organisations that, are continuing to delay and sort of prevaricate and say, well, this is something that actually we just can't afford to do. Are there any particular recommendations that you'd make to those organisations today?
Yeah, I think there are, Ian. I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is, genuinely, I passionately believe this. We are properly blessed in this country with the amount of good quality information that we have available to us. And a lot of that's been thought out really well. It's been learned from experience, sadly, through awful things happening. And the one piece of guidance that comes back time and time again is, if you find yourself caught in a marauding terrorist attack, the response is run, hide, and tell. Life doesn't really get, there are very few instructions in life that are going to be simpler than that. Run, hide, or tell, and tell, sorry. Now, the bit that's got sophisticated around that, and I'm glad it has, is that when you are responsible for these larger places, or you have customers on your premises, they're going to need help to run, hide, tell. And we define that as guide, shelter, communicate. And if everybody in the country had a plan to do that, we would almost certainly be compliant with Martyn's Law straight away. Guide, shelter, communicate. And so I would encourage people to start thinking in those terms. And I go back to, again, to what I said earlier, there's a critical pathway to guide, shelter, communicate. It's the ability to tell people to do those things. It's the ability to give advice to people in which direction to go. It's the ability to tell people to stay away from somewhere. It's the ability to send people to shelter. It's the ability to tell the police that something's happening, please come and help us. It's the ability to tell other people that something's happening. And so, it distills down to this thing that if you're going to get one thing right as a foundation upon which to build, it has got to be communication. Because nothing else works. If you don't communicate, you are effectively leaving it up to everybody else to decide for themselves what to do. That's chaotic. And I've seen the consequence of that. I've absolutely seen the consequence of that. And when we meet in a week or so's time, I'm going to talk about that a little bit, because it was a heck of a learning experience. 17th of December, 2017, Black Friday in the centre of London. And a piece of misinformation caused a mass panic through which people suffered severe and grievous injuries, and because nobody had a plan, nobody could communicate, nobody could get ahead of the incident. So communication, foundation for everything. And I've always been an advocate, Ian, that I work in a minority industry, counter-terrorism. Geez, not much of that happens, does it? Whereas actually people are getting harmed by safeguarding every day, or safeguarding incidents every day. People are getting harmed by drugs. People are getting harmed by public disorder. People are getting harmed by road traffic incidents. People are getting harmed by a range of threats. So what all those things together to try and prevent that sort of harm? It's communication, my friend. Absolutely communication. And look, I've never been embarrassed about stepping forward and saying this. One of the reasons I love working with you guys is because the quality and the flexibility and the adaptability that Safe Zone brings to all those different threats, and the ability to use communication to help people steer around, avoid, respond to those threats. So look, I'm an unashamed advocate of what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and obviously we're delighted to hear that, and indeed why so many healthcare and higher education organisations, not just here in the UK, but actually all around the world, already use Safe Zone. That notion of guide, shelter, communicate, the ability to communicate at scale and speed, as well as inform real-time decision-making, dynamic risk assessment, coordination of responders in order to keep entire communities safe. We definitely are at one on that point. So, Nick, I think all that remains is for me to thank you for your time, for sharing some of your expertise and insights with regards to the legislation, how we've arrived at this point, and indeed what we expect going forward over the next few months. And of course, we all eagerly await the passing of the bill through the next pre-legislative stages. So thank you for your time this afternoon. We look forward to going into more detail at our conference on the 15th and 16th of October at Loughborough University. And with that, I think we'll close the call. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Ian.